we have a choice of three gospel readings. We chose the Epiphany readings from Matthew because I thought it was important for people to hear the story of the Epiphany, the story of the wise men coming from the East. For many people around the world, Epiphany marks the day of true celebration rather than Christmas. Matthew deliberately shows Jesus coming from the beginning to offer salvation not just to the Jewish people, with whom the one God has always had a special relationship, but also people searching for truth as represented by the wise men. In Ireland, the Epiphany is celebrated as Women's Christmas. After making sure all the cooking, cleaning, gifting, getting to church, and decorating is done throughout the Christmas season, Epiphany marks a day of rest and relaxation and frivolity for women and especially mothers. In both cases, it is a day of celebration of Christmas, of God coming into the world for the others, the outsiders, for all of us. And so I think it is important that we mark the Epiphany in our readings. But at the same time, it means we do not hear the other two Gospels. We miss out on first, the continuation of Matthew. As we heard in our Gospel today, the wise men spoke to Herod about Jesus, and then they hurried off in another direction after finding Jesus. The story continues that Joseph is told in a dream to flee to Egypt, which he does with Mary and the baby, and then Herod unleashes mass murder of infant boys, trying to wipe out any rivals. And the Holy Family ends up settling a few years later in Nazareth, because Joseph decided that Galilee was safer than Judea, even after Herod's death. And so, according to Matthew, while Jesus grew up in Galilee, he did so as a refugee turned immigrant. Nazareth was his hometown, but Bethlehem is where he had his roots. Now, it should be said that there are no collaborating sources for the slaughter of the innocents as Matthew portrayed it. But the Herods were known for cruelty and mass murder, especially to maintain their power and to keep the Romans happy. So, as with Luke's census, it probably did not happen in this way, but it is not inconceivable that something like this happened. And I think the story of fleeing as a refugee family first to Egypt and then to Galilee and building a new life in Galilee, a week's journey away from their homeland, is something that many of our friends, neighbors, ancestors, and even many of us can identify with. And it is a reminder that in those refugee and immigrants living among us, our God is present. They represent the face of the divine in our midst. And this day of Epiphany, of revelation, of new insight, is about that revelation as well. The last of the three Gospels that are offered for today is from Luke. Now, Luke had a different understanding from Matthew as to how Jesus ended up in Nazareth rather than Bethlehem. But he was in agreement that Nazareth was Jesus' hometown. And Luke tells us the story of the 12-year-old, rather precocious Jesus, a boy a bit like my Ezekiel, who is taken down for one of the festivals to Jerusalem. Jesus finds the group of scribes and scholars of the temple who have access not just to the Greek translations of the scriptures, but the original Hebrew versions, and starts talking to them. And he gets really involved in what they are saying. And so when Mary and Joseph tell him to get packed up, it's time to go, he doesn't listen to them. And Mary and Joseph are traveling with a large group. So Mary is at the back with the women and the children, and Joseph is ahead with the men, making sure that the caravan has safe passage through treacherous hills, bad weather, and the threat of robbers. With Jesus being 12, he was in this weird time in life where he could at times be a kid and be hanging out with the women and helping out with the young children. Or he could be a young man and learning how to navigate, barter, watch the skies, and be prepared to defend the convoy. So Mary assumed he was with Joseph and the men, and Joseph assumed he was with Mary and the kids. And it is only when they stop and meet up and realize that Jesus is missing and that no one has seen him since Jerusalem. So then, with Jesus being the eldest, but as Luke tells us later, not their only child, Joseph and Mary have to either send the rest of the children on ahead with friends and relatives to Nazareth, or take their whole family, including, one would assume, infants and toddlers, back to Jerusalem to find Jesus. Either way, it takes a bit of time to organize, and between already having journeyed a day or more out of Jerusalem, resorting themselves for the trip back, and then making that trip, it has been 3 days by the time they find the young Jesus in the temple, casually debating the scriptures with the temple scholars. And Mary and Joseph are beside themselves with worry and frustration when they find Jesus, as any parent can understand. And Jesus is genuinely confused that they did not realize that, of course, he would be at the temple. Where else would he have gone? Now, the story is not one of an infant Jesus, but as with both the others, it does reveal in a profound way who Jesus is and who Jesus came into the world for. For the wise men, Jesus is the salvation, not just for one ethnic minority, but the entire world. For the flight into Egypt, Jesus came to be one of us and has particular solidarity with immigrants and refugees. And if we want to see Christ alive today, we should look to the faces of immigrants and refugees. And finally, Jesus came into the world to be a precocious child, making his parents crazy, asking questions of adults that make them really think, and not always paying attention when it is time to leave. And through these 3 stories, we see that Jesus, God made man, the Word made flesh, is the God that we need, but not the one we expect. God chose to become not just God in a human skin, but human in the most human of ways. A baby at home in his mother's arms, a refugee fleeing violence, a preteen with an overabundance of confidence and knowledge, and a lack of common sense. And God became one of us to show us not how to become gods, but how to be human, and to show us the face of God in one another. Amen.